On the 31st of January 1943, a German field marshal sat in the basement of a ruined department store in Stalingrad and waited for Soviet soldiers to come and take him prisoner. His name was Friedrich von Paulus. 24 hours earlier, Adolf Hitler had promoted him to the highest rank in the German military, field marshal, in the expectation that he would do what no German field marshal had ever done before: surrender. Surrender. Hitler had promoted him to die with his men. Hitler had promoted him to die with his men. A final act of propaganda. A last image of heroic sacrifice that could be used to dress up a catastrophe. Paulus refused. He surrendered. And by doing so, he handed the world an image that Nazi propaganda could not spin, could not bury, and could not explain away. A German field marshal in Soviet captivity, alive. The battle that produced that image, the Battle of Stalingrad, is remembered as the turning point of the Second World War. The moment the tide turned, the moment Germany's defeat became inevitable. But here is what most people don't know. The battle was lost before it began. Not at Stalingrad, not in the winter of 1942, but in a series of decisions made months earlier, decisions that created the conditions for the greatest military catastrophe in German history, long before a single soldier set foot in the city. This is the story of how Germany marched into a trap it built for itself, and why, even when the walls were closing in, it could not admit what was happening until it was far too late. To understand Stalingrad, you need to understand the situation Germany was in at the start of 1942. The previous year had not gone as planned. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union launched in June 1941, had been built on one assumption: the Red Army would collapse quickly, the Soviet state would disintegrate, and Germany would have won the war in the East before winter arrived. None of that happened. It was a strategy. By December 1941, German forces had been halted at the gates of Moscow and thrown back by a Soviet counteroffensive that nobody in the German high command had seen coming. The quick victory that was supposed to secure Germany's eastern flank had instead produced a grinding war of attrition against an enemy that kept finding new men, new tanks, and new reasons to fight. Worse, in December 1941, the United States entered the war. Hitler had always feared a two-front war. He had gone to enormous lengths to avoid it. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the rapid defeat of France, the hope that Britain could be negotiated or bombed into submission before the Eastern Campaign began. All of it had been oriented toward fighting one enemy at a time. Now he was fighting three: the Soviet Union, Britain, and the industrial colossus of the United States. Hitler's strategic situation in early 1942 was not yet hopeless. Germany still controlled vast territories. Its army, despite the winter setbacks, remained a formidable fighting force. And the Soviet Union, for all its resilience, had suffered catastrophic losses in 1941. Over 3 million prisoners taken, hundreds of divisions destroyed. But the window was closing. Every month the war continued, the material balance shifted further against Germany. Every month the United States mobilized more industrial capacity. Every month Soviet factories relocated beyond the Urals produced more tanks and guns. Hitler needed a decisive victory in 1942, a victory that would change the strategic equation before the coalition arrayed against him could bring its full weight to bear. And he believed he knew exactly where to find it. For Hitler, 1942's campaign in the East had one overriding objective: oil. Germany's war machine ran on fuel it did not have in sufficient quantities. Its own domestic production was minimal. Germany's war machine ran on fuel it did not have in sufficient quantities. Its own domestic production was minimal. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești supplied a significant share of what it needed, but not enough. Not nearly enough to sustain the kind of mechanized warfare that Barbarossa had demanded, and that 1942's campaign would demand even more of. In the southern Caucasus, beyond the Don and Volga rivers, lay oil fields at Maikop, Grozny, and the Great Prize, Baku on the Caspian Sea. Together, they produced roughly two-thirds of all Soviet oil output. Hitler's logic was elegant and, in isolation, not unreasonable. Seize the Caucasus oil fields and Germany would have the fuel to sustain a long war against the United States. Deny those same oil fields to the Soviet Union, and the Red Army's vast tank and aircraft fleets would eventually run dry. The campaign to achieve this was codenamed Fall Blau, Operation Blue, and it was the most ambitious German offensive since Barbarossa itself. The plan unfolded in stages. First, a massive breakthrough along the southern sector of the Eastern Front, sweeping through the Don Bend and capturing the city of Voronezh. Then Army Group South would split into two separate army groups. Army Group A would drive south toward the Caucasus and the oil fields. Army Group B would push east toward the Volga, establishing a blocking line from Stalingrad to Astrakhan that would protect Army Group A's northern flank and sever the Volga, the Soviet Union's critical north-south supply artery. Stalingrad was initially a secondary objective, a city on the Volga whose capture would anchor the northern end of Army Group B's blocking line. Its name, Stalin City, gave it psychological significance that exceeded its industrial value. But it was not yet the obsessive focus it would become. The plan had serious problems from the beginning. The most fundamental was strength. The German army that launched Operation Blue in June 1942 was not the same force that had crossed the Soviet border in June 1941. A year of fighting on the Eastern Front, plus the catastrophic winter of 1941 to 1942, had consumed its best formations. Divisions that were nominally at full strength were in many cases operating at half their authorized manpower. Tank numbers had recovered somewhat from the winter crisis, but replacement crews were less experienced than those lost. To compensate for these shortfalls, Hitler supplemented his German forces with large contingents from his allies, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies that were substantial in number, but considerably less well-equipped and less battle-hardened than the German formations they were expected to fight alongside. This decision, to fill the gaps in the German line with Allied troops, would have consequences that became apparent only when the gaps were tested. Additionally, the distances involved were staggering. The Front Army Group South was expected to advance across stretched over 2,500 kilometers. Additionally, the distances involved were staggering. The Front Army Group South was expected to advance across stretched over 2,500 kilometers. The supply lines that would have to support that advance ran across terrain that had already broken German logistics once. The rail conversion problem, Soviet broad gauge versus German standard gauge, had not been solved. The motor transport that bridged the gaps between railheads and the front was wearing out faster than it could be replaced. Wehrmacht logistics planners knew the numbers didn't add up. They said so in their assessments. The assessments were noted. The plan proceeded. Operation Blue launched on June 28, 1942. And for the first weeks, it looked like the summer of 1941 all over again. The Red Army collapsed before the German advance in what looked, from the German side, like the long-awaited final disintegration of Soviet military capacity. Soviet forces retreated across the steppe in what the Germans interpreted as a rout, vast open spaces swallowing entire Soviet armies as the panzers drove east. Voronezh fell in early July. German forces swept into the Don Bend. It seemed that the Soviet resistance in the south had finally broken. But here is what German command was misreading. The Soviet retreat was not a rout. It was a strategy. Stalin and the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, had made a calculated decision to trade space for time. Rather than allow their forces to be encircled and destroyed in the border regions, as in 1941, Soviet armies pulled back, preserved their strength, and drew the German advance further and further from its supply bases and into terrain that increasingly favored defense over attack. The German panzers drove east into the steppe and found empty ground. The encirclements they were designed to create, the great killing grounds that had produced 600,000 prisoners at Kiev in 1941, came up empty as Soviet forces slipped away before the net closed. And then, on July 23, 1942, Hitler made the decision that converted a difficult operation into an impossible one. He changed the plan. Seeing the Red Army apparently disintegrating before him, and impatient with what he saw as excessive caution in his commanders, Hitler issued Führer Directive 45. Both Army Group A and Army Group B were now instructed to pursue their objectives simultaneously rather than sequentially. Army Group A would drive immediately for the Caucasus oil fields. Army Group B, rather than establishing its Volga blocking line first, would take Stalingrad at the same time. These two objectives were hundreds of miles apart. The forces available were already stretched across a front that exceeded any operational depth they had been designed for. Splitting the effort between two simultaneous drives in diverging directions meant neither had the concentration of force that either one individually required. Worse, Hitler simultaneously removed forces from Army Group South, units that had been promised as reinforcement for the southern offensive, and sent them north to Army Group Center and North. He was reducing the force assigned to the most ambitious German operation of 1942 at the moment he was expanding its objectives. The German generals who saw the directive understood what it meant. They said so, quietly, in staff meetings, in careful language that tried to communicate alarm without triggering the reaction that direct challenge to Hitler's authority had produced in the past. The directive stood. The advance continued. And the trap that would close at Stalingrad in November began, in this moment in July, to take its shape. The Sixth Army under General Friedrich von Paulus crossed the Don on August 23, 1942, and reached the northern outskirts of Stalingrad. What greeted them was a long, narrow city stretching 40 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga, an industrial sprawl of factories, workers' housing blocks, and the rubble of what the Luftwaffe's opening bombardment had reduced to ruin. The bombardment killed civilians by the thousands and reduced much of the city to rubble. It also, inadvertently, created exactly the terrain that favored the defender over the attacker. Rubble is a defender's friend. Collapsed buildings create defensive positions that are nearly impossible to suppress with artillery or air power. Every pile of masonry is a sniper's nest. Every ruined factory floor is a killing ground that channels attackers into pre-registered fields of fire. The open-steppe warfare at which the German army excelled, speed, maneuver, bypassing resistance, encircling enemy formations, was useless in a city reduced to ruins. The defender of Stalingrad was General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army. A hard, driven, sometimes brutal commander who had survived his own failures in the winter war against Finland and who arrived at Stalingrad with a clear-eyed understanding of what his mission required. He did not try to defend the whole city. He defended the riverbank. If Chuikov's forces held a strip of land along the Volga, however narrow, however costly, the Sixth Army could not claim control of the river. And if the river remained contested, Soviet supply ferries could continue running from the eastern bank into the city, keeping 62nd Army alive despite taking losses that would have destroyed most armies. The Soviets developed a tactic they called hugging, closing so tightly with German units that German artillery and air support could not be used without killing their own men. In a city where the front lines ran through individual floors of the same building, where the distance between German and Soviet positions was sometimes measured in meters rather than kilometers, the Luftwaffe's bombers and the Wehrmacht's heavy artillery became less useful with every week the fighting continued. German soldiers called it the Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. Soviet snipers became a particular instrument of psychological pressure. They competed among themselves for kill counts, their names circulated in Soviet propaganda, their presence creating a pervasive fear in German units that made movement in daylight increasingly dangerous and eventually unthinkable in exposed areas. The most famous among them, Vasily Zaitsev, reportedly killed over 225 German soldiers. Whether the exact number is accurate matters less than the effect. The idea of the Soviet sniper embedded itself in German consciousness as a constant, invisible threat that couldn't be suppressed and couldn't be escaped. By mid-September, the battle had consumed German strategic priorities entirely. Hitler became obsessed with the city, whose name was his enemy's name. Orders came from his headquarters insisting on the capture of specific factories, specific streets, specific buildings, the micromanagement of a city battle by a supreme commander 1,000 miles away. More men went in, more men died. By October, 6th Army had captured 90% of the city. The remaining 10% clung to the Volga bank and did not break. And outside the city, while German and Soviet infantry fought over individual rooms in ruined factory buildings, the Red Army was doing something that German intelligence was not seeing clearly. It was massing. While the 6th Army ground itself to pieces in the rubble of Stalingrad, Soviet generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky were planning the operation that would end the battle, and with it, the last serious German chance to win the war in the East. Operation Uranus was not complicated. It was brutal in its simplicity. The 6th Army's flanks, stretching north and south of Stalingrad along the Don River, were held not by German divisions but by Germany's allied forces. The Romanian 3rd Army to the north, the Romanian 4th Army, and Italian units to the south. These were the weakest links in the Axis line, and Soviet planning had identified them with precision. On November 19th and 20th, 1942, two massive Soviet armored thrusts, over 1 million men, 1,500 aircraft, and 800 tanks, struck simultaneously from the north and south. The Romanian divisions fought with genuine courage. It made no difference. They were holding positions designed to be held by German divisions, with equipment that could not stop Soviet T-34 tanks, against an attack whose scale they had no capacity to absorb. The lines broke. Soviet armored columns poured through the gaps and drove deep into the German rear. They were not trying to advance on Stalingrad from outside. They were curving around it from north and south simultaneously, closing a circle. On November 23, 1942, 4 days after the offensive began, the Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalach, 40 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The 6th Army was encircled. 330,000 Axis soldiers, the entire 6th Army plus elements of the 4th Panzer Army, were now inside a pocket with no land supply corridor, no prepared defensive positions, and winter arriving with temperatures that would drop to -30 Celsius. What happened next is where the story of the battle becomes the story of an institution, the German military, discovering what happens when it cannot tell the truth to itself. Because in the days after the encirclement, 6th Army's commanders knew what was required. A breakout, immediately. Before Soviet forces could consolidate the ring, before the winter deepened, before the pockets, supplies ran out, Paulus requested permission to break out westward. Hitler refused. Stalingrad would be held. 6th Army would be supplied by air. A relief force would break through to them. None of these things were possible. Every senior officer who assessed the situation knew they were not possible. And the operation to prove them possible went ahead anyway. The Luftwaffe airlift to the Stalingrad pocket was a lie told at scale. 6th Army required a minimum of 500 tons of supplies per day to maintain combat effectiveness: food, fuel, ammunition, medicine, spare parts. At the absolute minimum for bare survival, roughly 300 tons per day. The Luftwaffe, factoring in available aircraft, Soviet air defenses, winter weather, and the distances involved from forward airfields, could realistically deliver between 80 and 120 tons per day. This was not a secret. The numbers were available to anyone who ran the calculation. Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe chief, had promised Hitler the airlift was possible. The officers who would actually have to fly it knew immediately that it was not. The relief operation, Winter Storm, launched in December under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was similarly constrained by arithmetic that made its success essentially impossible. The force Manstein was given was not strong enough to break through the Soviet lines that had formed around the pocket, particularly once the Soviets launched their follow-up offensive, Operation Little Saturn, that struck the Italian 8th Army to the north and threatened to encircle the relief force itself. Winter Storm was called off on December 23rd. 6th Army's last chance at rescue was over. Inside the pocket, Men were dying of starvation, frostbite, disease, and Soviet artillery in numbers that the high command in distant headquarters preferred not to calculate precisely. The official propaganda machine, run by Joseph Goebbels, had spent months portraying the battle for Stalingrad as a heroic German offensive. Now, with the Sixth Army encircled and visibly dying, the machine tried to convert the disaster into a different narrative: the heroic sacrifice, the fortress that held, the men who fought to the last. The promotion of Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30th was the final expression of this propaganda architecture. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. His promotion was intended to make surrender impossible. He would die, and his death would become the heroic narrative that clothed the catastrophe. He chose not to cooperate. On January 31st, he surrendered. In the following days, the remaining pockets of German resistance in Stalingrad collapsed. Of the 330,000 men encircled in November, approximately 90,000 entered Soviet captivity. Of those, fewer than 6,000 would survive to return to Germany after the war. The rest died in the pocket, of wounds, cold, starvation, and the Soviet camps that awaited those who had somehow survived all of the above. Stalingrad killed 500,000 Axis soldiers. It destroyed the Sixth Army, one of the finest fighting formations Germany had produced. And it did something to the German public and the German military's self-image that no amount of propaganda could fully repair. It proved that Germany could lose. Not stumble temporarily, not be delayed or set back. Lose, comprehensively, catastrophically. In a way that produced images: Paulus in captivity, the columns of frostbitten prisoners, the ruins of a city that had consumed an entire army, that could not be explained away. Goebbels tried. He proclaimed a national period of mourning. He reframed the disaster as heroic sacrifice. It didn't hold. The letters from the pocket had been arriving in Germany for months. Letters from men who described cold and hunger and the growing certainty that no rescue was coming. The families who received those letters knew something the official version of events refused to acknowledge. Within the military, the impact was more immediate. Stalingrad was the moment when the German officer corps, already shaken by Moscow, already living with the private knowledge that the strategic situation was deteriorating, began to confront a conclusion that most of them would not articulate openly for another year. The war could not be won, not because a single battle had been lost, but because the battle had revealed, in a way that could no longer be argued away, that the assumptions underlying German strategy were wrong. All of the warnings that had been raised before Barbarossa, before Operation Blue, before the July directive that split Army Group South, warnings about supply chains, about underestimating Soviet reserves, about the impossibility of winning a war of attrition against a coalition with superior resources, had materialized at Stalingrad in the most concrete possible form. 330,000 men surrounded because the flanks were held by Allied forces that weren't strong enough. An airlift promised because admitting it was impossible would mean admitting the encirclement was fatal. A relief operation launched because the alternative was acknowledging that the Sixth Army was already dead. At every stage, the institution chose the story it could tell rather than the reality it could not admit. And the cost of that choice was measured in the lives of the men inside the pocket. The war would continue for another 2 years after Stalingrad. Germany would fight with extraordinary skill and ferocity for every kilometer of ground it was forced to yield. Individual campaigns would produce results that surprised even its enemies. But the strategic direction was set in the rubble of that city on the Volga, in the surrender of a field marshal who chose not to die for a lie. Germany had lost at Stalingrad, and what it could not admit, what the propaganda machine and the high command and Hitler himself refused to acknowledge, was that losing at Stalingrad meant losing the war. The only question left was how long it would take and how much it would cost for that truth to become undeniable. This series has now traced the full arc, from the warnings before Barbarossa, through the failure at Moscow, to the catastrophe at Stalingrad. 3 videos. 3 moments where the same institutional failure repeated itself. The warnings existed, the analysis was clear, and the machine chose to proceed anyway. In the next video, we are going to step back from the Eastern Front entirely and ask the question that connects all of it. Could Germany have won? Not as a fantasy, as a serious operational question. At what point was the outcome genuinely in doubt? What decisions closed the window permanently? And what does the answer tell us about how wars are actually decided? Subscribe now if you want that video when it drops. And if this series has changed how you think about Stalingrad, not as a story about weather or about one man's obsession, but as the consequence of a system that could not tell itself the truth, drop that in the comments.